Hello, everyone, and welcome to our knowledge transfer series. I'm excited to talk today about understanding fees and really kind of diving in so you can kind of get a sense of how to read these. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about how to compare fees and understand them. We're going to talk about some challenges in comparing fees. We're going to talk about, questions you should ask yourself to find the right model. And then we're going to briefly talk about how we try and tackle this in our practice. A quick note here about myself. I have 17 years in the financial services industry. I really enjoy creating these videos and trying to give my knowledge out to the group so that people can be better educated in general. A quick disclosure statement. Today's information is general in nature. We try and make these videos as engaging and as specific as possible, but everyone's financial situation can be different, so we have to also treat this as general. So a topic that I find I'm pretty passionate about is trying to get people to understand the fees they're paying for investments and fees for value as a concept. Because, what I find today is that the average person has a lot of trouble understanding what they're paying for investment fees. And part of the problem here is the industry kind of does a bad job of explaining what fees you're being charged, and probably because they don't want you to realize you might be overcharged. And so when you look right here, you're going to see two similar funds with two similar strategies with two different fee stories, even though they look very similar, right? We have two 20/40 funds. And the first thing you got to watch out for is what's called the expense ratio. Now, it's very hard to avoid this on mutual funds or ETFs. And what the expense ratio does is every year you're charged this percentage across the year on your money. And it repeats every year. So if you have $100,000, you're paying 0.74% on that money every year, or 0.71%. But there's always this thing on here called the front end load. And the front end load is a commission you pay at the very front to buy something. And it could be anywhere from 0 to 5.75%. And when you look at the trailing returns on Morningstar, they actually don't take into account any commissions you might be paying to buy something. They're only looking at the expense ratio and the overall returns. And so we have to watch out for and one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, am I paying a commission on something? Because in this example, you have two funds that are really similar. They have very similar returns. And if you can avoid paying a commission, you probably want the fund on the right, not the one on the left. The other problem when we talk about fees is there's certain fees that I call major fees and certain fees I call minor fees. Now, I typically work with retiree and soon-to-be retirees. And when I look at fees for retirees, when I have a $500,000 account, if I'm paying $7 to do a trade, I don't consider that to be a major fee. I consider that to be a de minimis fee. You need to watch out for doing it a lot, right? You need to watch out for doing lots of trading costs. But overall, I don't consider that to be a major fee to watch out for, unless you have, say, small balances. So when we talk about fees, I'm really focusing on the big ones: expense ratios, commissions, and advisory fees. Now, I'm an advisor. I charge advisory fees. I try and make sure people understand that. And advisory fees are something that's defined by contract. And typically they're in addition to all these other costs we just talked about, expense ratios and commissions. So, when we add advisory fees to the previous examples that were at 0.7%, you're at 1.7% fees all in at that point. That could be pretty expensive. And so you gotta watch out for that. Advisory fees are charged by advisors. Now, there are some challenges when we talk about comparing fees, right? It's always easy to say, hey, just minimize fees as much as possible. But that's not always possible. And so let's talk about some of the challenges when we talk about comparing fees. And we're gonna use Vanguard on the left versus Fidelity on the right. And these two funds are very similar strategies, but they're not exactly like to like. It can be very easy to compare index funds as like to like funds and just minimize your fees and typically get better results. But what if they're not an index fund? What if it's not an exactly like to like situation? And in this example, you'll see that one has a higher expense ratio and actually has slightly higher returns than the one with the lower expense ratio. And that's partially because they're not exactly like to like. And when we talk about fees not always predicting returns, when you can find things that are as close to like, fees start to help predict returns actually very well. You really do want to minimize fees when we start talking truly like to like. But in this case, we have a balanced fund versus a balanced fund, right? This isn't an index. This is a Fidelity Vanguard's attempt to create a balanced investment pool that something like a retiree may want to buy. And you'll notice that the expense ratios on the left versus the right, the one with the higher expense ratios has the better returns. And so you're going to find that when we talk about comparing fees, one of the problems we're going to always run into is that fees don't always predict the returns correctly. And It's something I say about advisors because, I charge advisory fees. Now let's add 1% to this. If someone on the left was doing this on their own and had that fund, and then me as an advisor chose the one on the right that has better returns potentially, but I had a 1% fee there, I'm going to start making those fees very similar, or the returns very similar in nature when you take advantage of these fees. And so, one of the things you always got to watch out for is that advisors don't necessarily beat your returns. I can potentially find the better funds, but once I have my fees on there, you might not be doing that much better. And then complexity, can really make this harder. So you'll notice that when you make it simple and you make it as like as possible, fees are really critical to minimize. But when you add complexity, fees are much harder to compare. And in this case, you have two income strategies that are very different constructions, right? You have one strategy that is using covered calls to generate extra cash flow versus a more traditional high yield dividend ETF. And I have a lot of examples here where the fees that are higher have better returns, and I could have done the exact opposite. So don't let me push you too far into the pay more fees, you get better returns camp. But what I'm pointing out here is that because these two strategies are trying to accomplish similar goals, but they're very different constructions, it can be very hard to actually compare the fees here, and you actually want to really focus on your goals and results. So how do we take this information and try and find the right model for you? How do we kind of boil this down? Well, we have to kind of go through some basic questions you should ask yourself. Is avoiding fees your only goal? For some people, that's how they've set up their view of the retirement services or the financial services industry, and that's where they want to start with. And that's totally fine. There are lots of ways to make it work if that's your primary goal. But as you add complexity or want to add service, meaning you don't want to press the buttons, you're going to start paying more and more fees. When you start adding long-term planning, you're going to start paying more and more fees. If you're going to add advisor, whether it's a robo-advisor or a more in-person advisor like me, you're going to add in fees. So you got to kind of understand these questions of, are you putting yourself in a situation you should pay less fees or more fees? And then the more you can be laser focused, the more you can avoid fees, right? So, understand your emotional pain points and where you might want to hire someone versus not, or you really trust certain investments and you can hold on to those even when they're in a downturn. Those are ways, inventorying that emotionally for yourself are ways you can avoid fees. Figure out what you're trying to do and just kind of really laser focus this. Now, how do I handle this in my practice? Well, I always put my fees up front, but what I'm always trying to do is, can I figure out my value in someone's situation, right? I'm always interviewing someone going, am I adding value for portions, for all, or is this person really just good at doing it themselves, right? And so what I always try and commit to, and this is what every advisor I hope would do, is put my fees up there front, really focus on, am I adding value to a situation, explain conflicts of interest, and just get you further down your path with good knowledge. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this was a good conversation on fees, and we'll have more presentations for you coming in the future. Thank you.